42nd chapter of Genesis ends with Joseph still incognito to his brothers. They returned home from their supply trip to Egypt clueless that the high Egyptian official who'd accused them of being spies was the brother that they'd sold into slavery some 20 years before. And it wasn't just age that had, kept them from recognizing him. Joseph was decked out in the style and fashion of an Egyptian noble. Even more, expectations provided the best disguise of all. They had zero expectation to see their little brother in the role that he had now. We sometimes fail to see a thing simply because we have no mental category for it. Joseph's brothers may have wondered whatever happened to him after they watched him carted away by those Ishmaelite traders 2 decades before. But that he would rise to be second only to Pharaoh was nowhere in the realm of what they considered possible. So back home now in Canaan, forbidden by that harsh Egyptian official to return to Egypt lest they bring their youngest brother Benjamin, they probably wondered what would happen to Simeon, the brother they had to leave in Egypt as a hostage. They would have returned sooner, but Pops, Jacob, refused to let Benjamin, his now favored son, go. What caused him to reassess was the lingering famine. Verse 1. Now the famine was severe in the land, and it came to pass when they had eaten up the grain which they had brought from Egypt, that their father said to them, "Go back, buy us a little food." So the proverbial writing's on the wall. The drought causing the famine is still on. There aren't going to be any harvests before the food runs out. They didn't wait till there was no food before heading to Egypt. They made sure that there'd be plenty of time to travel to Egypt, a few days to gather supplies there, and then the trip home. So figure about a month. So when there was about a month's worth of supplies left, Jacob tells his boys to make another run to Egypt. And I say boys, but of course they're grown men. Judah reminds Jacob they can't go back to Egypt if Benjamin doesn't go with them. Verse 3, but Judah spoke to him, saying, "The man solemnly warned us, saying, 'You shall not see my face unless your brother is with you. If you send our brother with us, we will go down and buy you food. But if you will not send him, we will not go down, for the man said to us, you shall not see my face unless your brother is with you.'" Without Benjamin, all that awaits them in Egypt is death. But then, if they don't get supplies, it isn't just them who are going to die. So will Jacob and Benjamin. They'll die of starvation. As we read the next part, remember that God renamed Jacob Israel. Verse 6, and Israel said, "Why did you deal so wrongfully with me, as to tell the man whether you still had another brother?" But they said, "The man asked us pointedly about ourselves and our family, saying, 'Is your father still alive? Have you another brother?' And we told him according to these words. Could we possibly have known that he would say, 'Bring your brother down'?" Jacob asks a frankly silly question. Why did you tell the Egyptian you had another brother? If you hadn't, he never would have demanded that you take him there. Well, the brothers expressed their exasperation with their old man. How could they possibly have known that they'd be required to bring Ben? For goodness sake, they had just been accused of espionage, a crime which was punishable by death. They had no idea what kind of intelligence the Egyptians might have on them, so the best course was to tell the truth when they were asked about their family. Verse 8, then Judah said to Israel his father, "Send the lad with me, and we will arise and go, that we may live and not die, both we and you, and also our little ones. I myself will be surety for him, for from my hand you shall require him. If I do not bring him back to you and set him before you, then let me bear the blame forever. For if we had not lingered, surely by now we would have returned this second time." So Judah personally guaranteed Benjamin safely. If he fell in any kind of peril, Judah would take his place so that Benjamin could return safely to Jacob. Judah pressed this because it was obvious that they were cutting it close on time. They needed to leave now, or they'd not make it back in time to save Jacob and their own families from starvation. Verse 11, and their father Israel said to them, "If it must be so, then do this. Take some of the best fruits of the land in your vessel and carry down a present for the man. A little balm, a little honey, spices and myrrh, pistachio nuts and almonds." Now, hold on. If they have these items, is there a famine? Well, sure, could be. What caused most famines of that time was drought, a lack of rain. No rain, no grain. No grain, no bread. No bread. Well, none of the most basic of foodstuffs. It's nice to have spices, but you can't live on them, or balm, or honey, or myrrh. And nuts, well, a nice addition to a diet can't sustain over the long haul. Also, nut trees can produce even during dry spells since their roots go deep, while grain, well, that depends on regular rain. The idea here is that these items were treasured in famine-struck Egypt and would make a nice present to grease the wheels of favor with a reluctant official. So Jacob goes on, verse 12. Take double money in your hand and take back in your hand the money that was returned in the mouth of your sacks. Perhaps it was an oversight. Now, you may remember that from the last chapter that Joseph ordered the money that they had paid for the grain that they bought from the Egyptians be put back in their luggage. They didn't discover that it was there until they were, partway home. They were all spooked, concerned if they were caught and inspected by one of the Egyptian patrols in the area, they would be accused of stealing. But of course, they weren't caught because it was Joseph who had their money returned to them. Verse 13. Take your brother also and arise, go back to the man. And may God Almighty give you mercy before the man, that he may release your other brother and Benjamin. If I'm bereaved, I'm bereaved. So note that Jacob is called by his new name, Israel here. Maybe because he's, finally living by faith. Verse 15. So the men took that present and Benjamin, and they took double money in their hand, and arose and went down to Egypt, and they stood before Joseph. Details of their trip are passed over. The narrative shrinks it down to they went to Egypt, and once again they stand before this scary Egyptian guy. Verse 16. When Joseph saw Benjamin with them, he said to the steward of his house, and pause right there, note that. The one-time slave now has a chief steward that is a house manager, meaning he owns a large estate. Joseph says to his house manager, his chief steward, take these men to my home and slaughter an animal and make ready, for these men will dine with me at noon. Then the man did as Joseph ordered, and the man brought the men into Joseph's house. So the brothers have to be thinking, what is going on here? How many random foreigners come to Egypt for food because of the famine are invited to the prime minister's house? None, probably. But these guys are. And note that they're given a special feast at a time of famine. Well, verse 18. Now the men were afraid because they were brought into Joseph's house, and they said, it is because of the money which was returned in our sacks the first time that we're brought in, so that he may make a cause against us and seize us to take us as slaves with our donkeys. So, guys, feeling guilty much? Thinking maybe turnabout is fair play? We sold our brother to be a slave in Egypt, only fitting that we end up that way too. Well, note the addition of their donkeys as the potential target of Joseph's scheme, whatever it is. We read here in Genesis that the famine became so severe that the people sold everything they had to buy grain, including they sold even themselves, it says. It may be that things were so bad at this time in Egypt that all the animals had been slaughtered and eaten. That does happen in cases of severe famine. Starvation causes people to do all kinds of crazy things. Verse 19. When they drew near to the steward of Joseph's house, they talked with him at the door of the house and said, "Oh, sir, we indeed came down the first time to buy food, but it happened that when we came to the encampment, we opened our sacks, and there each man's money was in the mouth of a sack, our money in full weight. So we have brought it back in our hand, and we've brought down other money in our hands to buy food. We do not know who put money in our sacks." But he said, meaning the chief steward, "Peace be with you. Do not be afraid. Your God and the God of your father has given you treasure in your sacks. I had your money." And then he brought Simeon out to them. So the brothers try to preempt a finding of guilt by telling the steward about what had happened. They hadn't stolen grain on their first trip. There must have been some kind of misunderstanding because, their money was all back in their sacks. But they brought it back and wanted to make sure that it got into the right hands. And that's when Joseph's steward told them he's the one who had overseen their supplies on that earlier trip. Everything was cool. They need not worry in the least. He'd taken their payment. If there was money in their sacks, it must have been God's blessing, which had to then cause these guys to wonder why they're now at the Egyptian's house. This is the final phase of Joseph's testing of what kind of men they were. Verse 24. So the man brought the men into Joseph's house and gave them water. They washed their feet. He gave their donkeys feed. And then they made the present ready for Joseph's coming at noon, for they heard that they would eat bread there. And when Joseph came home, they brought him the present which was in their hand into the house, bowed down before him to the earth. Then he asked them about their well-being and said, Is your father well, the old man of whom you spoke? Is he still alive? And they answered, Your servant our father is in good health. He's still alive. And they bowed their heads down and prostrated themselves. So this is the second time they bow to him, fulfilling not just his earlier dream of bowing to him, but that there were two such dreams. Joseph inquires about their father, who, unknown to them, is also Joseph's dad. Verse 29, Then he lifted his eyes and saw his brother Benjamin, his mother's son, and said, Is this your younger brother of whom you spoke to me? And he said, God be gracious to you, my son. I wonder if it wasn't beginning to dawn on some of the brothers that something unusual was going on. How could this Egyptian official, who surely must see a couple hundred people a day at least asking for relief from the famine, remember the previous conversation? He remembers them to the point of asking after their father and recognizing Benjamin as not having been there before. I know a few people who are amazing at remembering people they've met, but how could someone in Joseph's position remember some random dudes who show up for food, and when he sees them again months later, remembers all the particulars of their prior meeting? And that's why I say, I wonder if some of the brothers were getting a little suspicious about this entire thing. Verse 30. Now his, that is Joseph's, heart yearned for his brother, so Joseph made haste and sought somewhere to weep, and he went into his chamber and wept there. Overcome with emotion, Joseph found a quiet place to let it out. He didn't want to let his brothers see him break down, not yet at any rate. Well, because he still had to make sure that it was safe to reconcile with them. Would treachery once again raise its ugly head among them? Verse 31, Then he washed his face, came out, he restrained himself and said, Serve the bread. And so they set him a place by himself, and them by themselves, and the Egyptians who ate with him by themselves, because the Egyptians could not eat food with the Hebrews, for that is an abomination to the Egyptians. So think of this now. The tables were arranged in three groups. Joseph had a table to himself. His brothers had their own table, but the Egyptians had another. Though Joseph was the prime minister, he wasn't Egyptian, and according to their customs, could not eat together. That ought to have been a clue to the brothers about Joseph's identity. Verse 33. And they sat before him, the firstborn according to his birthright, and the youngest according to his youth, and the men looked in astonishment at one another. So when it came time to seat the guests, Joseph had instructed his attendants to seat them according to their age, from eldest to youngest, which blew their minds. Joseph is slowly giving them hints. He wants them to know what's going on, but it's what he does next that ought to have been the biggest clue. Verse 34. Then he, again Joseph, took servings to them from before him, but Benjamin's serving was 5 times as much as any of theirs, and so they drank and were merry with him. All of his life, Joseph has served because he was a servant, and that's what servants do. And we can be sure that years before, even as his father groomed him to lead the family, Joseph served his brothers. He served in Potiphar's house, he served in the prison, and he served as prime minister. Serving his brothers now, in this setting, was meant to reveal to them who he was. But they weren't ready to see him yet, so they couldn't see him. When Joseph arrived at Benjamin's place, he piled on 5 pita breads, 5 scoops of mashed potatoes, 5 scoops of ice cream. We read in verse 1 of chapter 44, And he commanded the steward of his house, saying, Fill the men's sacks with food, as much as they can carry, and put each man's money in the mouth of a sack. Also put my cup, the silver cup, in the mouth of the sack of the youngest, and his grain money. And so he did according to the word that Joseph had spoken. So Joseph directs his steward to do the same thing as before. Give them grain and put the money that they paid for it back in their bags. But this time he adds an item, a special cup made of silver. A bit later, Joseph will say that he used it for divination, something the Egyptians and many others of the ancient world were into. There were different ways that they divined things, that is, seeking supernatural insight into the future or getting the truth of an otherwise hidden matter. They would read the pattern of tea leaves in the bottom of a cup or the dregs, the residue left over by wine. Joseph told his steward to secret the cup into Benjamin's luggage. You see, Joseph's got a plan, and we see now what it was. Verse 3. As soon as the morning dawned, the men were sent away, they and their donkeys. I've always found it curious that in light of what had happened last time, before they set out, that they didn't check their bags to see if their money had been returned again. Verse 4. When they had gone out of the city and were not yet far off, Joseph said to his steward, "Get up, follow the men, and when you overtake them, say to them, 'Why have you repaid evil for good? Is not this the one from which my Lord drinks, and with which he indeed practices divination? You've done evil in doing so.'" Joseph's test of his brothers is almost complete. There's one last thing to determine. What will they do with Benjamin if given the chance to be rid of him? So early the next morning, they're sent off. Because Joseph wants to get all of this over with, they aren't far away when the steward chases them down, calling them to halt, which they do, probably because the steward has some troops with him. He reports that a special cup's missing, and the brothers are suspected of having it. The steward bluffs, saying, "Of course my master knows one of you stole this cup. It's hard to hide theft from someone that practices divination." But of course Joseph did no such thing. That just gave the steward grounds to search their stuff. Verse 6. So he, the steward, overtook them, and he spoke to them these same words. And they said to him, "Why does my Lord say these words? Far be it from us that your servants should do such a thing. Look, we brought back to you from the land of Canaan the money which we found in the mouth of our sacks. How then could we steal silver or gold from your Lord's house? With whomever your servant is found, let him die, and we also will be my Lord's slaves." The brothers were appalled at the charge that they'd stolen the cup. Theft was abhorrent to them. Wasn't bringing back the money from the first batch of supplies proof of their integrity? So abhorrent was the idea of theft, and so certain were they of their innocence, they had no hesitation in saying that if the cup was found among them, whosever sack it was in would die, and the rest of them would return to Egypt as slaves. Verse 10, and he said, "Now also let it be according to your words. He with whom it is found shall be my slave, and you shall be blameless." The test wasn't to make them slaves, although that was a nice touch of irony, wasn't it? The test that Joseph conducted aimed to prove what they would do with Benjamin if they had a chance to be rid of him. Would they jump at the opportunity to ditch him so that they could have a better chance at the inheritance, as they had with Joseph years before? Verse 11, then each man speedily let down his sack to the ground, and each opened his sack, and so he searched. He began with the oldest and left off with the youngest, and the cup was found in Benjamin's sack. Then they tore their clothes, and each man loaded his donkey and returned to the city. Now the steward had said that the only one who needed to return with him to Egypt was the one who was caught with the cup. But when the cup was found with Benjamin, they all returned. Verse 14, so Judah and his brothers came to Joseph's house, and he was still there, and they fell before him on the ground. And Joseph said to them, "What deed is this that you have done? Did you not know that such a man as I can certainly practice divination?" Now note that. In Egypt, someone in Joseph's station would be expected to practice divination. He's not saying he actually did. Indeed, Joseph had no need to practice occult art since he'd intentionally set this whole thing up. He says this because the test isn't complete yet. He needs to stay incognito for just a bit. The climax of the story is approaching rapidly. Verse 16. Then Judah said, "What shall we say to my Lord? What shall we speak? Or how shall we clear ourselves? God has found out the iniquity of your servants. Here we are, my Lord's slaves, both we and he also with whom the cup was found." So Judah becomes their spokesman because he intends to fulfill his pledge to Jacob to be surety for Benjamin. Ben's life was forfeit, but Judah offers himself in his place. He begins by offering that all of them would become slaves. Judah confesses his guilt, though what he's guilty of isn't stealing the cup. His crime was greater, selling Joseph into slavery, and it's time to pay the piper. But if Benjamin can't go back home, none of them would, because it'd be the end of their father. They're all willing now to give up their inheritance and follow their brother into slavery in a foreign land. And that is precisely what Joseph has been hoping and waiting for, to see this broken contrition. But he has to make sure that Judah and the others mean it, and so he grills them a little more. Verse 17, but he said, far be it from me that I should do so. The man in whose hand the cup is found, he shall be my slave. And as for you, go up in peace to your father. Then Judah came near to him and said, O my lord, please let your servant speak a word in my lord's hearing, and do not let your anger burn against your servant, for you are even like Pharaoh. My lord asked his servant, saying, have you a father or a brother? And we said to my lord, we have a father, an old man, and a child of his old age, who is young. His brother is dead, and he alone is left of his mother's children, and his father loves him. Then you said to your servants, bring him down to me, that I may set my eyes on him. And we said to my lord, the lad cannot leave his father, for if he should leave his father would die. But you said to your servants, unless your youngest brother comes down with you, you shall see my face no more. And so it was, when we went up to your servant my father, that we told him the words of my lord. And our father said, go back and buy us a little food. But we said, we cannot go down. If our younger brother is with us, then we will go down, for we may not see the man's face unless our youngest brother is with us. Then your servant my father said to us, you know that my wife bore me 2 sons, and the one went out from me, and I said, surely he is torn in pieces, and I have not seen him since. But if you take this one also from me, and calamity befalls him, you shall bring down my gray hair with sorrow to the grave. Now therefore, when I come to your servant my father, and the lad is not with us, since his life is bound up with the lad's life, it will happen, when he sees that the lad is not with us, that he will die. So your servants will bring down the gray hair of your servant our father with sorrow to the grave. For your servant became surety for the lad to my father, saying, if I do not bring him back to you, then I shall bear the blame before my father forever. Now therefore, please let your servant remain instead of the lad as the slave to my lord, and let the lad go up with his brothers. For how shall I go up to my father if the lad is not with me, lest perhaps I see the evil that would come upon my father? So this is it. This is the proof that Joseph needs to know it's time to reveal himself, but you'll have to wait